She saved his life, but by dawn, the world would call it a kidnapping. It was the ultimate paradox of loyalty. The act of preserving the most dangerous man in the city would nearly cost Nia her freedom, her reputation, and her future. He was bleeding out in the back seat of her economy car, a man who commanded legions reduced to a trembling weight against the upholstery, and she made the only choice her conscience would allow. She took him to the only safe place she knew. She did not know then that by bringing the dragon into her sanctuary, she was inviting the fire that would threaten to burn down everything she had built. The cameras would capture the departure. The whispers would fill the vacuum of silence, and by the time the sun rose, the narrative would spin out of her control. She helped, but it almost cost her everything. Before we unravel the long, terrifying night that changed everything for Nia and her enigmatic employer, take a moment to pause. We are building a community of story lovers here. Scroll down to the comment section right now and tell us where you're watching from today. Is it a quiet evening at home? Or are you on a break at work? Let us know, and make sure you have subscribed to the channel to never miss a story like this. Now, let's turn the clock back 12 hours, before the blood, before the fear, to a moment when the night was still young and the biggest concern was a stain on a silk tablecloth. The evening began at 7 p.m. with a polite, suffocating murmur of high society. The gala was held in the cavernous ballroom of the St. Regis, a venue that smelled of lilies and old money. Nia stood near the periphery, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. As the personal assistant to Daehyun, the CEO of Ryung Corp and the rumored head of the city's most formidable syndicate, her job was to be invisible until she was necessary. She wore a simple black dress, professional and unassuming, designed to blend into the shadows while he commanded the light. Her eyes, however, never stopped moving. She scanned the room, tracking the movement of waiters, the whispers of rivals, and the subtle shifts in Daehyun's body language. He stood in the center of a circle of investors, a glass of scotch untouched in his hand. He looked like a statue carved from marble and ice, his face unreadable, his suit tailored to an impossible sharpness. To the room, he was a predator in a cage of his own making. To Nia, he was a man who looked exhausted, his shoulders carrying a tension that only she, after 3 years of managing his life, could perceive. The air in the ballroom was cold, artificially chilled to preserve the elaborate ice sculptures and the heavy makeup of the socialites, but Nia felt a bead of sweat trace the line of her spine. She checked her phone. 7:42 p.m. The schedule was tight. He was supposed to leave in 18 minutes. She watched him nod at a senator, a gesture that was dismissive yet polite enough to avoid insult. It was a delicate dance of power. Nia adjusted her glasses, her stomach tightening with a vague, undefined anxiety. Usually, these events were routine, a parade of handshakes and hollow compliments, but tonight felt different. There was a static charge in the atmosphere, a heaviness that pressed against her chest. She watched a man in a waiter's uniform linger too long near the exits. She saw Daehyun's eyes flicker toward the mezzanine, his jaw tightening. He knew, whatever was happening, he was already calculating the angles. Nia took a step forward, ready to intervene, to pull him away with a fictitious phone call, but he caught her eye. It was a microscopic shake of the head. "Stay back." She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, forced to obey the silent command of a man who thought he could outmaneuver fate. By 9:15 p.m., the carefully orchestrated elegance of the evening had unraveled into chaos, though the guests inside the ballroom remained blissfully unaware. Nia had been waiting by the service entrance, the designated extraction point, tapping her heel against the concrete. The alleyway was dim, illuminated only by the sickly yellow buzz of a street lamp and the glow of the city's skyline in the distance. The silence here was heavy, filled with the distant hum of traffic and the scurrying of rats near the dumpsters. She checked her watch again. He was late. Dae-hyun was never late. Punctuality was not just a preference for him, it was a mechanism of control. If he said he would be at the car at 9:10, he would be there at 9:10. The delay was a siren screaming in her mind. Her thumb hovered over the security protocol button on her phone, a direct line to his head of security, but hesitation paralyzed her. If she called it in and she was wrong, she would look incompetent. If she didn't call it in and she was right, he could be dead. The sound of a heavy metal door crashing open shattered her internal debate. Nia flinched, stepping back into the shadows of the brick wall, her breath catching in her throat. Dae-hyun stumbled out of the service exit, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He was not the marble statue anymore. He was a man fighting to stay upright. One hand was pressed violently against his side, his fingers clutching the fabric of his white dress shirt, which was now blooming with a dark, terrifying crimson stain. He didn't look at her. He looked at the pavement, gasping for air, his legs buckling. Nia moved before she thought. The paralysis vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline that made her hands shake, but her mind crystal clear. She rushed to him, catching his weight just as his knees gave out. He was heavy, a solid mass of muscle and bone that threatened to drag them both to the dirty ground. She smelled it immediately. The metallic, copper tang of fresh blood mixed with his expensive sandalwood cologne. It was a nauseating cocktail of luxury and violence. Dae-hyun looked up at her, his eyes glassy and unfocused, sweat beading on his pale forehead. He gripped her arm, his fingers digging into her skin with bruising force. No hospitals, he wheezed, the words wet and strained. No police, Nia's mind raced. The protocol dictated that she drive him to the private clinic on the west side, a facility on the payroll, but as she looked at him, she saw the terror in his eyes. He wasn't just wounded, he was hunted. If they went to the clinic, whoever did this would be waiting. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The system was compromised. There was nowhere safe. She looked at his bleeding side, then at her car parked 10 feet away. It was a humble Honda Civic, invisible, unassuming. It was the last place anyone would look for a Mafia Don. Okay, she whispered, the gravity of her decision settling in her stomach like a stone. Okay, I've got you. She wasn't his assistant anymore. She was his lifeline. Getting him into the vehicle was a physical ordeal that felt like it lasted hours, though the dashboard clock insisted it was only 9:48 p.m. Nia had to drape his arm over her shoulder, bearing the brunt of his weight as she half-dragged, half-carried him toward the passenger side. Every step was a battle against gravity and his fading consciousness. He groaned, a low, guttural sound of agony that made her own insides twist. She fumbled with the keys, her fingers slippery with his blood. It was on her hands, on the sleeve of her dress, a stark, undeniable evidence of the line she was crossing. When she finally maneuvered him into the seat and reclined it back, he looked small. The powerful CEO was reduced to a broken man in a budget sedan. She slammed the door, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet alley, and ran to the driver's side. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumline of panic. Start the car. Just start the car. As she pulled out of the alley, the city transformed. It was no longer the metropolis she knew. It was a labyrinth of threats. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror became a potential assassin. Every red light was a trap waiting to spring. Nia drove with a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, her eyes darting between the road and Dae-hyun's pale face. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, muttering in Korean, his hand still clamped over his wound. She needed to get him off the streets. She needed supplies. She needed a place that didn't exist on his enemy's maps. The realization of where she was going terrified her more than the drive itself. She was taking him home, to her apartment. It was a breach of every professional boundary, a violation of the unspoken contract between them, but the alternative was watching him die in the passenger seat. The drive was a blur of neon lights and shadows. At one point, a police cruiser pulled up beside them at an intersection. Mia stopped breathing. She stared straight ahead, her hands trembling on the wheel, praying that the tint on her windows was dark enough, praying that Dae-hyun wouldn't groan or shift. The seconds stretched into eternity, the red light mocking her with its unblinking stare. When the light finally turned green and the cruiser turned left, she let out a breath that was half sob. She risked a glance at Dae-hyun. His head was lolling to the side, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Stay with me," she said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "We're almost there. Just hold on." He didn't answer, but his fingers twitched against his shirt. He was fighting. She pressed the accelerator, risking a speeding ticket, risking everything, desperate to reach the sanctuary of her anonymity. The arrival at 10:30 p.m. was a collision of two worlds that were never meant to touch. Mia's apartment complex was a modest brick building in a quiet, working-class neighborhood, miles away from the glass towers where Dae-hyun reigned. She parked in the back, under the cover of an overgrown oak tree, and scanned the perimeter. It was quiet. A dog barked in the distance. A television flickered blue in a neighbor's window. Normalcy. It felt alien now. She hauled him out of the car, the physical strain burning in her shoulders. The elevator was out of order. It was always out of order, so she had to help him up 2 flights of stairs. He was barely conscious now, his feet dragging, his breathing ragged. They stumbled into her apartment, and she kicked the door shut behind them, engaging all 3 locks with trembling fingers. The living room was small, cozy, filled with the scent of lavender and old paperbacks. It was her refuge, a space of soft throws and warm lighting. Seeing Dae-hyun there, bleeding onto her beige carpet, felt like a violation of the laws of physics. She guided him to the sofa, pushing aside a pile of laundry she hadn't folded yet. He collapsed onto the cushions, his dark suit stark against the floral pattern. Mia didn't have time to be embarrassed about her mess. She rushed to the bathroom, grabbing her first aid kit, towels, and a bottle of rubbing alcohol. When she returned, he was trying to sit up, his eyes scanning the room with a hazy confusion. "Where?" he rasped. "My home," she said, her voice firm, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. "You're safe, but I need to see the wound." She knelt before him, her hands hovering over his shirt. The intimacy of the moment was suffocating. She had to unbutton his shirt, peeling the fabric away from his skin where the blood had made it stick. He hissed in pain, his abdominal muscles contracting. Mia tried to keep her hands steady, tried to be clinical, but the heat radiating from him was overwhelming. Under the layers of designer silk, he was just a man, vulnerable, hurt. She cleaned the wound, a deep gash, likely from a knife, missing vital organs, but bleeding profusely. He watched her face as she worked, his dark eyes lucid for a moment, studying her with an intensity that made her cheeks burn. There was no barrier of desk or title between them now, just the raw reality of flesh and blood. She packed the wound, binding it tight with gauze, her fingers brushing against his warm skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered as he flinched. "I have to stop the bleeding." He reached out, his hand covering hers for a brief second. It was a touch of gratitude, or perhaps desperation, but it sent a shockwave through her. "Thank you," he murmured, before his eyes rolled back and he slumped against the cushions. The hours between midnight and dawn were the longest of Mia's life. It was 1 a.m., and the apartment was silent save for the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic, labored breathing of the man on her couch. She had changed out of her blood-stained dress into sweatpants and a t-shirt, scrubbing her skin until it was raw, trying to wash away the metallic smell of the night. She sat in the armchair opposite him, a kitchen knife resting on the side table, her phone in her lap. She was the silent guardian, watching over a fallen king. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump. Every car passing on the street below sent her to the window, peering through the blinds with paranoid eyes. She looked at Dae-hyun. In sleep, the lines of cruelty and command had vanished from his face. He looked younger, softer. She wondered about the life that had led him to this moment, bleeding on an employee's sofa. She wondered about the enemies who had done this. And then, the cold dread of reality set in. What would happen when the sun came up? She hadn't taken him to the hospital. She had disappeared with him. To the outside world, to his security team, to his rivals, what did this look like? Did it look like a rescue? Or did it look like a kidnapping? The optics were a disaster. A lower-level employee vanishing with the CEO on the night of an attack. Nia buried her face in her hands. She had acted on instinct, on a moral imperative to save a life, but the social and professional consequences were beginning to take shape in the dark. If he died on her couch, she would be charged with manslaughter. If he lived, she might be targeted by whoever wanted him dead. She was a pawn who had accidentally stepped into the line of fire of queens and kings.
2:14 a.m.
The digital clock on the microwave stared at her. She checked his pulse again, steady but weak. She adjusted the blanket over him, her hand lingering near his shoulder. She was terrified, exhausted, and completely alone. She had done the right thing, the human thing. But as the first gray light of morning began to threaten the edges of the curtains, Nia realized that in his world, the right thing was often the most dangerous move of all. At 5:45 a.m., the world was painted in shades of charcoal and slate, a monochromatic stillness that belied the violence of the previous night. Nia sat on the floor, her back pressed against the armrest of the sofa, watching the rise and fall of Dae-hyun's chest. She had dozed off for perhaps 20 minutes, a fitful, shallow sleep haunted by dreams of sirens, only to wake with a gasp when a floorboard settled in the hallway. Now, the adrenaline had soured into a heavy, aching fatigue that settled deep in her marrow. She reached for the mug of coffee she had brewed, the ceramic warm against her cold palms. The smell of the dark roast clashed dissonantly with the lingering scent of rubbing alcohol and dried blood. She took a sip, the bitter heat grounding her, and when she looked up, she found him watching her. His eyes were open, dark pools of consciousness in a face drained of color. There was no disorientation in his gaze, no groggy confusion. He was awake, and he was assessing the threat level of her living room. "You're awake," Nia said, her voice raspy from disuse. She set the mug down on a coaster, an absurd, habitual gesture of tidiness in the midst of a crisis. Dae-hyun tried to shift, a grimace tightening his jaw as the movement pulled at the stitches she had improvised with butterfly closures. He let out a sharp breath through his nose, abandoning the effort to sit up. "Nia," he said. It was the first time in 3 years he had said her name without a directive attached to it. It wasn't "Nia, bring the car," or "Nia, cancel the meeting." It was just her name, spoken with a quiet, bewildered reverence. He looked around the room, taking in the framed posters of vintage jazz festivals, the stack of unread mail on the console table, the softness of the throw blanket tucked under his chin. It was a glimpse into her humanity that he had never bothered to see from the height of his glass tower. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. "You should have dropped me at the clinic. You should have left." Nia shifted on the floor, drawing her knees to her chest, hugging her legs as a barrier between them. The intimacy of the moment was thick, almost suffocating. The morning light was beginning to touch his face, softening the harsh angles of his cheekbones. "The clinic wasn't safe," she answered, her gaze dropping to the pattern of the rug. "You know that."
"And I
couldn't leave you." "That's not who I am." Dae-hyun slowly extended his hand from under the blanket. It was a struggle for him, a tremor running through his fingers, but he reached out until his fingertips brushed against her arm. The contact was electric, a sudden, searing connection that made her breath hitch. He didn't pull away. He traced the line of her forearm, his touch a silent acknowledgement of the blood, his blood, that she had washed off her skin hours ago. "You risked everything," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers. "Do you understand what happens if they find me here? Do you understand what they will do to you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with a threat that wasn't directed at her, but for her. For a moment, the boss and the assistant ceased to exist. There was only a man who was hurt and a woman who had saved him, suspended in the fragile quiet of dawn. By 6:30 a.m., the fragile bubble of their sanctuary was punctured by the digital world. Nia had gone to the kitchen to refill her water glass when her phone, which she had silenced and placed face down on the counter, began to vibrate. It wasn't a call, it was a deluge. A continuous, angry buzz that rattled against the granite countertop. She picked it up, her stomach dropping as she saw the notifications stacking up like dominoes. Missed calls from the office. Missed calls from unknown numbers. Alerts from news apps. Her finger hovered over a breaking news notification, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She tapped it. The screen filled with a live feed from a local news station. The banner at the bottom screamed in urgent red block letters, "Ryung Corp CEO missing following gala attack." But it was the subheadline that made the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and dizzy. "Police seek person of interest. Executive Assistant Nia Bello." They had a photo of her. It was her corporate ID photo, stark and unsmiling, plastered next to a grainy security camera still from the St. Regis garage. The image showed her helping a stumbling Daehyun into her car. To Nia, it showed a rescue. To the world, stripped of context and narrated by a grim-faced anchor, it looked like an abduction. Sources say Bello was seen forcing the wounded CEO into her personal vehicle, the reporter's voice tinny and accusatory. Authorities are concerned for Mr. Kim's safety, citing recent internal disputes at Ryung Corporation. "We are treating this as a potential kidnapping." Nia dropped the phone. It clattered onto the floor, the screen cracking, a spiderweb fracture over her own face. The narrative had been hijacked. She wasn't the guardian anymore. She was the villain. The optics she had feared had manifested into a nightmare scenario. She had done the right thing, but the camera lens had distorted it into a crime. She walked back into the living room, her legs feeling like lead. Daehyun was sitting up now, leaning heavily against the back cushions, his eyes sharp and alert despite the pain. He saw her face, the terror etched into her wide eyes, the trembling of her lips, and he knew. "They're spinning it," he stated, not a question but a confirmation. Nia nodded, unable to speak, tears of frustration pricking at the corners of her eyes. "They think I kidnapped you," she whispered, the absurdity of the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "They think I'm hurting you." Daehyun's expression darkened, a flash of the ruthless CEO breaking through the veneer of the wounded man. He tried to stand, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the sofa arm. "Give me the phone," he commanded, his voice gaining a hard edge. "I will end this," but as he tried to put weight on his legs, his knees buckled, and he collapsed back with a groan of frustration. He was powerful, yes, but in this room, in this condition, he was helpless to stop the machine that was chewing up her reputation. He looked at her, and for the first time, Nia saw genuine fear in his eyes, not for his life, but for what his world was about to do to hers. 7:15 a.m. brought the sound of the approaching storm. It started as a low thrumming in the air, a vibration that rattled the window panes in their frames. Nia moved to the window, peering through the slats of the blinds, her breath fogging the glass. Far down the street, turning the corner with silent, predatory grace, were 3 black SUVs. They weren't police cars. There were no sirens, no flashing lights. These were sleek, armored vehicles with tinted windows that absorbed the morning light, Ryung Corp security, or perhaps a rival faction. It didn't matter. Both options were lethal. The neighborhood, usually waking up to the sound of school buses and garbage trucks, was about to be invaded by a paramilitary force. "They're here," Nia said, her voice hollow. She turned to Dae-hyun. Black SUVs. 3 of them. Dae-hyun cursed in Korean, a sharp, violent sound. "My security," he said, breathing hard. Or, "my brothers." If it's my brother's men, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He looked at Nia, his eyes intense and pleading. "You need to leave. Go out the back fire escape." Now, Nia shook her head, an instinctive denial. "I'm not leaving you." Dae-hyun grabbed her wrist as she moved closer to help him. His grip was weak, but his intent was iron. "Listen to me," he hissed, the proximity bringing his face inches from hers. "If they come through that door and they think you are a threat, they will not ask questions. They will shoot. You have to run." "No," Nia said, pulling her hand away, but staying planted. A strange calm had settled over her, the clarity of the doomed. "I brought you here. I am responsible for you." She looked at him, seeing the man beneath the myth, the human being she had spent the night keeping alive. "And if I run, I look guilty. I look like the kidnapper they say I am. The only way I survive this is if you tell them the truth." She knelt beside him, her hands hovering near his shoulders, ready to shield him or support him. The sound of heavy boots on the pavement outside echoed up the stairwell. Doors were being banged on below. They were clearing the building. The distance between the ordinary world and the violent underworld had vanished. Nia looked at the door, then back at Dae-hyun. "Tell me what to do when they breach," she asked, her voice steady despite the terrifying pounding of her heart. "Do I raise my hands? Do I get on the ground?" Dae-hyun reached up, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The gesture was shockingly tender, a moment of pure romance in the center of the crosshairs. "Stay behind me," he whispered. "Just stay behind me." The breach at 7:45 a.m. was not cinematic. It was terrifyingly efficient. There was no warning shout, no demand to open up. The lock on Nia's apartment door simply disintegrated under the force of a battering ram, the wood splintering with a deafening crack that sounded like a gunshot. The door flew open, bouncing off the wall, and the room was instantly filled with men in tactical gear. They moved like a fluid shadow, weapons raised, laser sights cutting through the dust motes in the morning air. "Hands! Show me your hands!" A voice bellowed, distorted by the adrenaline of the assault. Nia screamed, an involuntary reflex, and threw herself backward, scrambling toward the sofa. 3 reds danced across her chest, hunting for a vital organ. "Stand down." The command came not from the men, but from the couch. Dae-hyun had forced himself upright, adrenaline overriding the agony in his side. He stood swaying, one hand pressed to his wound, the other raised in a gesture of absolute authority. "I said stand down." The lead tactical officer froze. The barrel of his rifle, which had been leveling at Nia's head, lowered an inch. The silence that followed was heavy, vibrating with the potential for death. The officer, a massive man with a scar running through his eyebrow, lifted his visor. It was Kenji, the head of Dae-hyun's personal guard. He looked from his boss, bleeding and pale, to Nia, who was pressed against the wall, shaking violently. "Sir," Kenji said, his voice confused, his weapon still at the low ready. "We have the target. The extraction team is." "She is not a target," Dae-hyun snarled, the ferocity of his tone making him look 10 feet tall despite his injury. He took a stumbling step forward, placing his body between the gunman and Nia. It was a physical shield, a declaration of protection that defied all protocol. She is the only reason I am breathing. Anyone who points a weapon at her answers to me. Nia watched from the floor, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would bruise her ribs. She saw the shift in the room. The tension didn't vanish, but it changed flavor. The soldiers lowered their weapons fully. The narrative in the room shifted from hostage rescue to medical evac. Dae-hyun turned to look at her, ignoring his men. He extended a hand to her, ignoring the blood seeping through his shirt. "Get up, Nia," he said softly, the contrast between his command to the men and his tone with her jarring. "You're safe." She took his hand, her legs trembling as she rose. She wasn't just an employee anymore. In the eyes of everyone in that room, she had just become untouchable. The aftermath was a blur of controlled chaos, but the resolution, when it came, was quiet. It was 9 a.m. They were in the back of one of the armored SUVs, speeding away from her apartment, away from her old life. A medic was working on Dae-hyun's side, but Dae-hyun's attention was entirely on Nia. She sat on the opposite bench seat, wrapped in a thermal blanket, staring out the darkened window at the city passing by. She felt hollowed out, the adrenaline crash leaving her numb. Her phone had been recovered and replaced. The PR team was already issuing statements, correcting the narrative, painting her as the hero she was. But the public vindication mattered less than the silence in the car. "I will fix the apartment," Dae-hyun said, his voice low, cutting through the hum of the tires. The door, the carpet, everything. Nia looked at him. He was cleaned up slightly, and 4-line running into his arm, but his eyes were the same ones that had watched her from the sofa. "It's just an apartment," she said quietly. "It was a home," he corrected. "You brought me into your home." He leaned forward, wincing slightly, closing the distance between them. The medic pretended to be busy with a gauge. Dae-hyun took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles. It wasn't a handshake. It was a promise. "You saved my life, Nia. But you lost your anonymity. You can't go back to how it was." "I know," she whispered. The fear of the future was there, but it was different now. She wasn't facing it alone. "Then we go forward," he said. "Together." He didn't let go of her hand. As the car turned toward the secure estate that would be their temporary fortress, Nia realized the irony was complete. She had almost lost everything by doing the right thing. But as she looked at the man holding her hand, a man who looked at her with a mixture of awe and possession, she realized she had gained something she never dared to want. She had walked into the fire, and she hadn't just survived. She had tamed the dragon. And for the first time in 12 hours, she exhaled.